everyone. Welcome to the last episode of a series of podcasts that we have been producing on public-private partnerships. DAWN is a network of feminist scholars, researchers, and activists from the economic south. We have been analyzing and advocating on development issues for many years now. And today we want to share with you our final thoughts about this project we have developed on public-private partnerships, their impact on women's livelihoods and on inequality gaps. I am Corina Rodríguez Enríquez. I am part of DAWN's executive committee, and I am here with my two colleagues.
Hi, everybody. I am Masaya, Llavaneras, Blanco. I am also part of DAWN's executive committee and part of the PPP project.
And I'm Sue Godt. I'm a retired development worker, and I'm supporting the work of DAWN.
So in this project, we have been increasingly challenging the mainstream narrative and practice that locates and promotes the private sector as the key actor in development, and that leads to the marketization of what we think development should be. More recently, we have focused on analyzing the so-called process of corporate capture of the state and global governance, which implies that transnational corporations, often associated with national economic elites, impose their interests as if they were collective interests. In this way, they capture the development agenda and define priorities usually more associated with search for business opportunities rather than with meeting social needs. To do this, we have carried out a set of case studies focusing on public-private partnerships, or PPPs for short, in countries in the Global South. We wanted to generate clear evidence about how the discourse promoting the advantages of PPPs is built at the country level and how legal frameworks are framed to allow them, taking into account the key role of global economic governance institutions, most importantly, the World Bank Group. We wanted to identify the implications of using PPP modalities when providing social goods and services, about their impact on inequality gaps, and about whether there is resistance to this type of development model.
Exactly, and the value added of this project to the existing research and analysis on PPPs was specifically to apply a feminist analytical framework. DAWN has always recognized that women's human rights are lost or gained in the interplay between the personal and the structural environment. While household and family relations are a critical side of gender power, women are also workers, members of communities, struggling for land and livelihoods. They are agents in societies undergoing cultural transformations, and they are actors in economies shaped by globalization, but also militarism. And they are part of production systems that are unmindful of ecological limits. We therefore believe that the study of PPPs should not focus only on the specific impact on women's lives. It should rather focus on the way PPPs contribute or not to deepen a financial capitalism that commodifies life, plunders land, and destroys nature, and advances a predatory system that puts profit ahead of the sustainability of life and the boundaries of the planet. We applied a detailed, intersectional, and interlinkages approach that analyzes the roles, influence, and levels of power of the main actors, whether public, private, especially corporate, and civil society. We analyzed the role of regulatory and legal frameworks, the specific dynamics and characteristics of PPP design and implementation, and of course their impact on gender and human rights. We also analyzed the effects on transparency and accountability, governance and democracy, and levels of resistance, paying attention to how PPPs were experienced by different communities in the Global South.
So overall, we supported 10 case studies that covered different experiences across the Global South. There were 6 case studies in Africa, and that included Sierra Leone, Senegal, Ghana, in West Africa, Ethiopia, and Kenya in East Africa, and Zimbabwe in Southern Africa. There were 2 case studies in Latin America. That was in Peru and Mexico. And there were 2 in the Asia-Pacific region, and that was India and Fiji. The case studies also covered different sectors and types of PPPs. There were case studies about infrastructure at local and national levels, and that was in Ghana, Senegal, and Mexico. There was a case study on energy development. That was in Sierra Leone and Ethiopia. And finally, there was a focus on service delivery, really through the lens of providing health services. And those case studies were in Kenya, Zimbabwe, Peru, India, and Fiji. So despite the broad coverage, there's significant commonality across these experiences. So in every case, the narrative is that PPPs are a legitimate, vital mechanism for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, for achieving visions of Africa rising, and for Global South economic development. And this dominant development framework gives a key role to the private sector, and it's fully embedded in the global capitalist system. As mentioned earlier, powerful global institutions such as the World Bank Group actively promote the model. The research documented the many negative impacts and risks that emerged and showed how PPPs have been advancing the structural drivers of this neoliberal model of development. Crystal Simeone from Kenya clearly describes the process.
It's also important to pan out a little bit and to have the backdrop of what the World Bank has been thinking and pushing down the throats of many former colonized regions and nations, the idea of maximizing finance for development, and specifically the cascade approach of the World Bank that really pushes governments to open up to private finance and de-risk their investment of private finance in public services. So if you have a problem with your health services, the World Bank is like, well, we have a private solution for you. You need to change your policy framework and legislation framework to make it accessible to private finance. But on top of that, you need to be able to de-risk their investment since you are high risk, and so guarantee essentially a profit that they will be making irrespective of what goes on in your country, whether that's climate, whether that's war, whatever it may be. The country must, guarantee a profit to this private finance for their investment.
In this overview podcast, we're going to highlight 3 of the key issues identified during the research. More detail is available in the many different outputs that we've produced, and we'll let you know how you can access them at the end of this podcast.
So the first issue that we wanted to highlight has to do with PPPs having the potential to restrict people's access to services and lower their quality, thereby threatening and weakening people's rights to development. This can happen especially when PPPs financing imposes user fees, which very often makes services unaffordable for large sections of the population. Because PPPs are profit-driven, they are really developed in unprofitable sectors, even when there are social inequalities and urgent gaps to fill. This was evident in the PPPs developed to improve health services. For example, in Fiji, instead of providing the free services needed by the population, 2 key public hospitals were turned into PPP-managed facilities, offering specialized medical services aimed at attracting medical tourism. Meanwhile, in Kenya, the government invested in a PPP to purchase specialized medical equipment for 98 hospitals around the country. Despite spending upwards of $500 million, much of the equipment didn't address health priorities or wasn't used. Crystal explained that. Let's listen to her.
Between 2008 and 2009, the northeastern region of Kenya, in a survey done, 68% of women were reported to not have access to maternal hospitals because the hospital was just too far. And so again, bringing to light a question of who decided that they needed this high-tech equipment over very basic medical care and facilities. So the saddest thing is that many of the hospitals this equipment was going to didn't have a number of things. It didn't have 3-phase electricity. They had no running water sufficient to run the equipment, and there really weren't enough requisite doctors who had the technical knowledge to operate the equipment. So many of them lie unused up until today at these facilities.
Health insurance is widely promoted as the way to achieve universal health coverage and to improve access to services for the poor. But the case studies in India and Peru provide evidence of the opposite result. Sulakshana Nandi studied the impact of India's national health insurance, PPP, which reimburses public and private hospitals for providing selected services. Women in particular have had unnecessary procedures, and poor families have been left with astronomical costs for the so-called additional services. Let's listen to Nandi, who explains that.
The case study finds that the scheme has really enabled private interests to gain control over women's own bodies, which are seen as a means of making profit. Therefore, they are subjected to unnecessary procedures and other forms of treatment. Funds that should have been spent directly on women's health and would have ensured that they are able to access the services that they need and require have instead been routed through the PMJY. And in a context of an unregulated and a very powerful private for-profit sector, the public funding for private provisioning has clearly proven to be a disaster for women. And within all this, women do not even have any role in decision-making or any kind of participation at any stage of PMJY implementation or monitoring, even though they are the ones who have been most affected by it.
As an alternative to these kinds of PPPs, all the authors of the case studies call for strengthening the existing public and primary health system to ensure that universal quality services are provided.
The second issue that we wanted to highlight was that poor regulation of PPPs has caused serious social and environmental damage. For example, poor planning, lack of impact assessments prior to project approval, flawed normative frameworks, as well as weak state capacity to monitor implementation have all served to increase the risk of negative impacts. This was particularly evident in 3 of the case studies. In Mexico, there's been development of transport and green energy projects in the narrow isthmus of Tehuantepec, which connects the Gulf of Mexico and the Pacific Ocean. In Senegal, a major toll road project was built to connect the capital city of Dakar to the new airport to the south. And in Sierra Leone, a large-scale bioenergy project was developed to export green energy to Europe and, in theory, to meet urgent national needs for electricity. In all cases, however, there have been deeply detrimental effects on livelihoods, community, and the environment. Husseinato Abdullah graphically describes what happened in Sierra Leone. Let's listen to her.
The entire ADAPT Sierra Leone project is a farce. It brought to the fore the flaws in the PPP development model because there were 6 international development agencies funding the project. The main project funder or initiator was the ADAPS Oryx group in Switzerland. And they developed the project in Sierra Leone, and all these development agencies came on board. The African Development Bank was very central and did most of the feasibility studies for the project. Unfortunately, after 2 years, the project closed. And lack of transparency and accountability is actually run around across the project. For instance, the communities were not told anything. They were not given any heads up, but the development finance institutions, they all got their monies back and left the people hanging with nothing. Their lands were taken. They could not even go back to their lands because it was a 50-year lease, and this was just after 2 years. And all the development projects they promised the people did not even materialize. So these people became poorer than they were when the project started.
The third issue or aspect of our research that we wanted to highlight was that the case studies documented a clear lack of participation in project selection, in project design, and monitoring of the PPPs in general, and the absence of transparency or accountability mechanisms. Often, these projects did not go through the normal procedures of procurement, and contract details remain unpublished. Paradoxically, PPPs are presented as a strategy that would improve the governance of development and service delivery. Reality was the opposite in all the cases we studied. The implementation of PPPs was characterized by opacity. There were few or no mechanisms for conducting proper consultations with communities at the project development stage. Thus, PPPs have restricted democratic accountability and increased the scope for corruption as negotiations remain mired in commercial confidentiality. In Fiji, for example, Lide Kokanasiga explains.
What we gathered while doing this research was that there was no particular point at which the government announced that we need this particular model to help one of our major hospitals to operate, and that will be given to a foreign investor. We were trying to find the beginning of that, but the only thing that we got was, it will be good for a tourism medical hub for Fiji, and we'll have specialized services in terms of surgeons and everything that's needed to better the tertiary services for Fiji.
Without any consultation, the government made the only pension fund in the country, the Fiji National Provident Fund, into the local partner with the Australian company Aspen Medical, which was given the contract to run the hospitals. The fund's resources were allocated to the PPP, resulting in a decrease in the amount paid out to pensioners. In summary, the research has shown the contradictions between the narratives of development, modernization, democracy building, and the reality on the ground. PPPs are deeply embedded in the global capitalist system and have a profound impact on democracy and governance. The evidence has larger implications beyond PPPs and extends to the overall dominant narrative that frames development. Daniel Castrejón and Julieta Lamberti powerfully discuss these issues which emerged from the case study in Mexico.
Se trata de un proyecto que no ha cumplido con el respeto a los derechos humanos, ¿no?
This is a project that has not complied with human rights, nor with basic issues such as transparency, nor the obligation to adequately inform the communities, the people who live in the territories that would be most impacted. It has not been properly done. And from the outset, this is a project that favors big capital companies, a project that puts the region's resources at the service and disposal of companies so they can carry out their activities. There is not necessarily a relationship with the welfare that the communities could obtain, isn't it? The government and the companies see this territory merely as the possibility of generating profits and as objects for commodification. The communities, on the other hand, see this corridor as a space rich in natural resources, embedded with history and symbolism. Their perspective goes beyond a mere patrimonial stance to maintain life. The company's perspectives, however, are based on the extraction of resources without the guarantee of preserving life for the populations in the future. Since the beginning, it's been advertised as a development project that will generate well-being, but based on private investment and economic growth. Obviously, this is nothing new. This is how capitalism, or the capitalist system in which we live in, works, which is undoubtedly a patriarchal system as well.
The case studies highlighted the kind of alternatives that are needed to address the risks and negative impacts of PPPs. It is critically important to push back and change the dominant narratives about the superiority of the private sector in delivering development and about the state lacking skills, resources, and finances to drive national priorities. Instead, there is need to contest and inhabit the state, to reclaim it, so that it can fulfill the right to development of the people in the terms that communities and societies desire. We need to think of people as part of decision-making processes, right holders, and not passive recipients of whatever development is implemented in their name. There is also an urgent need to reform the international financial architecture that pushes development financing based on austerity models and prioritizes the economic interests of the elites in the global north. The case studies also conveyed a sense of hope because there were consistent efforts to resist the PPP model and mechanisms. Action took place at different levels. Locally, for example, by market women in Ghana or by indigenous communities in Mexico's Isthmus region. Nationally, for example, by unions and health activists in Peru and India. Given the global drivers of this model, some authors also pointed out the importance of global engagement. As Sulakshana reflected,
And I think more and more social movements are finding that it's really important to build solidarity with each other with regards to linking with global movements. Again, I would say, that too is very important, because even our collection of case studies shows that, even though all of us were from different countries, so much of what we documented was similar with regards to the principles of PPP and what happened, the implications on women. So in this sort of globalized world, it's really important for us to build our globalized solidarity. And within the People's Health Movement, for instance, with the publicly funded health insurance schemes, we have been trying to document similar experiences in other countries, both in Africa and in Asia regions, and also from Latin America, bringing that evidence together, writing that together, and advocating for changes at the global level. Collective action and solidarity across issues, geographies, and movements is essential, and that really gives one hope.
As we end, our final reflection is that the evidence points to increasing risks and negative impacts of PPP on people, communities, systems, the environment, and ultimately on national sovereignty. Significantly, the PPP mechanism is deepening the structural drivers of global capitalism and accelerating the corporate capture of development. However, people affected are not standing by and are mobilizing to resist these models and to build alternatives. Given the dominance of global actors driving this model, it is important that everyone is aware of the processes and the linkages, that we act collectively to counter them and to build an equitable vision for our countries and societies. Thank you, everyone. Dawn continues to develop this work. If you have further questions about this project, please check our website for links to a range of outputs, including podcasts with the authors, accompanying animated or live action films, articles in journals, and an open access book entitled The Corporate Capture of Development, Public-Private Partnerships, Women, Human Rights, and Global Resistances. The book can be freely downloaded with the full case studies. You can find everything in our website, www.dawnfeminist.org. Thank you.